So taking a look at what we have here, this is the reserve requirement and the money multiplier. We started this the previous class that we saw, and in another world, this would be referred to as the money creation process. This is the money creation process. And so when we are studying the Fed, one of the things that we learned is that the Fed implements what's called monetary policy. Monetary policy is any action by the Fed that is meant to increase or decrease the money supply. We learned then that there are 3 tools for the Fed to increase or decrease the money supply through monetary policy. The first tool was open market operations, and that was the buying and selling of bonds. We learned that the second tool is called the discount rate. The discount rate is the interest rate that local banks pay the Fed for a loan. And the discount rate enables local banks to get easy money, cheap money is another way to say it, maybe 0% or 1%. And then they lend it to customers like me and you. And so if my local bank, which is a commercial bank, decides to take out a loan from the Fed, which would be something like $1 million, for example, they then would turn around and lend all of that money out to their customers. Now, maybe they're paying the Fed 1%, but they're going to charge their customers a variable percentage based on what's called a credit score. That variable percentage could be anything from 3 to as high as 15%. And then they will collect all of that interest, and then they will pay the Fed the 1%, and then they can keep all the juice in the middle for themselves. The third tool of the Fed is called the reserve ratio. And that is what we're taking a look at again here today. This sheet that you're looking at then gives us a mathematical explanation of how to use the reserve ratio. The reserve ratio, if you recall, is the amount of money that a local bank, a commercial bank, always has to hold on site. So looking up here where it says reserve ratio, this is required reserve, and there's a typo there that should say reserve, or perhaps should say required reserve ratio. This number is set by the Fed. This is policy, and local banks must obey this number. And then what that means is every time new money comes into the bank, then they have to allocate that money accordingly. Now, we're going to change this sheet. We're not going to use 25,000. We're going to use 20,000. That'll make the math much easier. And so we're going to use this first problem. I'm going to call this problem A. We're going to use this first problem to define these words for you, and then we'll give a better definition here in a minute. Required reserves are the amount of money that local banks have to hold on site. This is mandated by the Fed. So if I deposit $20,000 into my local bank and the reserve ratio is 5%, this reserve ratio means that of the new money, they have to hold 5% on site permanently. So looking at our 20,000, 5% of 20,000, well, 10% would be 2,000. So half of 10% is 5%. So half of 2,000 is $1,000. The required reserve at 5% of 20,000 would be $1,000. What this means then is the bank then is allowed to use the rest as what is called excess reserves. Excess reserves are what are also known as loanable funds. Loanable funds are dollars that the bank can lend, obviously. So of my 20,000 that I put in, 1,000 has to be held on site. The remaining 19,000 is allowed to be lent. The bank is required to hold a specific amount of money on site because they have to have money on site to meet the needs of their customers. If I go to the bank to withdraw money, then I'm going to need them to give me the money. And in fact, they have to be able to give me the money. If they can't give me the money, then they are not solvent and they'll go out of business. They will have to close their doors. And then they'll get put out of business by the Fed. Obviously, if a bank gets put out of business by the Fed, then all of the accounts get transferred to another bank. Your money doesn't disappear. That's called Federal Deposit Insurance money, FDIC. So this is the immediate change to the bank, right? AP is going to ask you 2 tiers of questions. They're going to say, because of a deposit, how is the bank affected? They're going to say, because of the deposit, how is like the economy affected, or the system? They'll say the total economy. They might say the total system. And by that, they'll say banking system. But more specifically, they might say money supply. How is the money supply affected? If they're talking about the economy, the banking system, or the money supply, then they're referring to the money multiplier. That means we have to multiply. And the money multiplier is found by taking, and I'm going to just write it over here. The money multiplier is found by taking 1 divided by the ratio. The ratio then, of course, is set by the Fed. That means the money multiplier is going to be 1 divided by 0.05. 5% written as a decimal is 0.05. So how many nickels in a dollar? 5 cents goes into a dollar 20 times. That is our first multiplier. And so finding the money multiplier is a function of the required reserve. So in row B here, doing none of the other math, this would then be 1 divided by 0.1, because 10% written as a decimal is 0.1. 10 cents goes into a dollar 10 times. Notice as the reserve ratio gets bigger, the multiplier is getting smaller. We're going to skip 15 because it's ugly. AP would never ask that. So we're just not even going to do it. We'll call it row C. Maybe we'll do it for fun later, but we're not going to do it now. Row D, 1 divided by 0.2, 20 cents goes into a dollar 5 times. Row E, 25 cents, 1 divided by 0.25, 25 cents goes into a dollar 4 times. Notice as the reserve ratio gets bigger, the money multiplier gets smaller. This is the key centerpiece to the following statement. Reserve ratio goes up. That means money supply goes down. This relationship defines that. Now, we've used this for monetary policy a bunch of times. It defines it because look over here where it says maximum amount of money expansion. This is what I was talking about when I said lent, spent, saved. Lent, spent, saved, lent, spent, saved. If I take $20,000 out of the bank to pay for my kid's college, then I give that $20,000 to my kid's college. My kid's college then is going to take that $20,000 and they're going to put it in their bank. And then their bank is going to be allowed to go through this process of on-site or excess reserves. And then they're going to lend the money accordingly. So over here, when it says maximum amount of money expansion, what they're really asking is the change in the money supply. That delta symbol means change. And so change in money supply is a pretty common thing for them to ask. This means change in money supply. And when they ask about this, it could be a decrease or it could be an increase. That depends on if they're raising or lowering the money supply. And this process is also referred to as money creation or money expansion, but we don't really like the word money expansion because we don't know if it's being increased or decreased. This concept collectively then is called the fractional banking system, because here's what we have to do. In order to calculate the change of the entire money supply, we have to take the excess reserve times the money multiplier. And in this case then, what that means is the excess reserve of 19,000 times the money multiplier of 20. So 20 times 19,000 is $380,000. That means that when I put money into the bank, let's say I had $20,000 in cash in my drawer at home. If I took that $20,000 in cash and deposit into the bank, my bank then would have to keep 1,000 cash on site, but they'd lend 19,000. That 19,000 would spin through the economy, lent, spent, saved, lent, spent, saved, lent, spent, saved, and it would create a total sum of $380,000. This would be called the maximum amount of money expansion, or the change in the money supply, or the total change of money in the banking system, either way that they want to do it. So let's look at row B just to walk through it one more time. Row B, then we see that the required reserve is 10%. That means of the original 20,000 coming in, they now have to hold $2,000. This is a whole new problem. Of the original 20,000, that means 18,000 is what we can refer to as excess, or sometimes called loanable funds. In this case, we calculate the money multiplier as 10. That means if the question asks what's the maximum change in the money supply or in the entire system, that would be 10 times the excess reserves. That means this is $180,000. We're going to skip row C. Row D, we can do this all again. In row D, what we see is that we have 20% of the original 20,000 now. That means this is $4,000. There are two ways you could do that. This is 1/5 of that, so 20 divided by 5 is 4. Or you could use the number 10 off of this. 10% is half of 20%. So 10% is 2,000, so 20% is double 2,000, so it's 4,000. The loanable funds in this scenario are 16,000. Multiplier is 5, 1 divided by the 0.2 or the 20%. And then 5 times the excess reserves. Remember, the money multiplier times the excess reserve gives us the amount of money creation or expansion. And this is from new deposits. And when this happens, then 5 times 16 is $80,000. The last one, I'm going to give you a minute to do it before I go through the answers, but I am going to keep recording, and then later you can just fast forward the video. I'll give it like 10, 20 seconds here.
Mr. Bell?
We're recording. Can you wait till after we're done recording?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And so in the last row then, 25% on-site reserves, this is 1/4 of 20,000, so this is $5,000. That means this has to be 15,000. Multiplier is 4, 1 divided by 0.25. So 4 times, remember this is money multiplier times excess reserve. 4 times 15 is $60,000. And this is an overview of what is called reserve requirement money creation using the money multiplier.